Hello, little friends. Welcome to Huggy Bear Kids Bedtime Stories where magical adventures begin. Sit back, relax, and get ready for fun-filled stories that will take you to amazing places. Let's dive into today's tale, full of laughter, learning, and lots of excitement. Are you ready? Let's go! The ant and the grasshopper in a vast, sunlit meadow, surrounded by towering trees and a tranquil stream. The world was alive with movement. The grass swayed in the soft breeze, and the sky, a brilliant blue canvas, stretched endlessly above. This was a place where nature flourished, each creature finding its role in the grand design of life. Here, the rhythm of seasons defined everything, from the plants that grew to the animals that lived. At the heart of this beautiful meadow, nestled among the roots of a large oak tree, lay the ant colony. It was a bustling, vibrant place, constantly alive with purpose. The ants, hardworking and organized, were a model of efficiency. Every ant had its job, whether it was gathering food, maintaining the nest, or protecting the colony from danger. Their tunnels and chambers, cleverly constructed beneath the soil, were the lifeblood of their society. There was no time for frivolity in the life of an ant. Their focus was always on survival, preparation, and perseverance. Above ground, the meadow was teeming with life. Wild flowers bloomed in vibrant hues, and the trees offered shade to the creatures who passed by. One such creature, a young grasshopper, spent most of its days hopping from one sunlit spot to another, basking in the warmth of the day. The grasshopper had little interest in the serious matters that consumed the ants. It preferred to play, sing, and enjoy the beauty of life in the present moment. The contrast between the ant colony and the carefree grasshoppers couldn't have been more stark. While the ants scurried about, working tirelessly to gather food for the colder months ahead, the grasshoppers seemed to have no concerns. The sounds of their music filled the air, and their laughter echoed across the meadow. For them, life was about living in the now. But even in the midst of such joy, there were whispers among the older ants. They spoke of the coming winter, of the hard times that would follow the carefree days of summer. They knew that every ant must work hard to ensure survival, for the cold months would bring hunger and hardship. Yet, every time the young ants discussed these matters, the grasshoppers laughed, dismissing their concerns. One such ant, a diligent worker named Antonia, often found herself at the forefront of these discussions. Antonia was not just an ant. She was a leader among her colony. From the moment she had hatched, she had understood the importance of hard work and perseverance. It was this drive that had earned her the trust and respect of the other ants. She was always the first to rise at dawn, the last to leave the fields, and the most organized of them all. Antonia's days were filled with purpose. She led groups of worker ants through the tall grass, gathering seeds and storing them in their underground chambers. The sun beat down on them as they worked tirelessly, but Antonia's resolve never wavered. She believed wholeheartedly that it was through collective effort and dedication that their colony would survive the harshness of winter. There was no time for distractions, no room for play. The grasshopper, on the other hand, was often seen hopping near the edges of the meadow, a flute-like instrument made from reeds in its hand. The music that emanated from it was beautiful, filling the air with a melody that made everything seem perfect, eternal. The grasshopper loved to play during the day, hopping between blades of grass, basking in the warmth of the sun. To the grasshopper, life was fleeting, but in the moment, it was all that mattered. He would look at the ants, so busy was their work, and shake his head in amusement. His name was Grayson, and he was known throughout the meadow for his carefree nature. Grayson had no worries about the future. The days stretched before him, each one filled with songs and joy. He often wandered through the meadow, looking for a comfortable spot to rest, occasionally sharing a tune with the passing butterflies or birds. It was a life of freedom, without the burden of preparation or responsibility. The ants, however, were growing uneasy. As the days grew warmer, they knew that summer would soon end. They spoke among themselves about how to store enough food for the winter months. Each day, Antonia would encourage her fellow ants to work even harder, reminding them of the dangers that lay ahead. She was focused and determined, but she couldn't ignore the sight of Grayson, hopping about with his flute, oblivious to the worries of the world. One afternoon, as Antonia worked with a group of ants near the edge of the meadow, she overheard Grayson's voice. He was singing a song, his tune floating on the breeze. It was light and carefree, full of joy and celebration. The words of the song echoed in Antonia's mind. "Oh, the world is bright and wide. Why waste time on the things I hide? Let the future wait its turn. For today, there's a song to learn." Antonia paused for a moment, looking at the grasshopper. She felt a pang of frustration. How could he be so carefree, so oblivious to the work that needed to be done? The cold winds of winter would soon blow across the meadow, and Grayson seemed to care only for the present. Shaking her head, Antonia turned back to her task. But deep down, she couldn't help but wonder, could Grayson's carefree attitude be a kind of freedom? A freedom from worry, from the relentless march of time? Or was he simply foolish, ignoring the wisdom of those who understood the cycle of life? As the day wore on, Antonia knew the answer. She had seen firsthand how hard work, preparation, and responsibility were the foundations of a thriving community. It was her duty to ensure that the colony would be ready for the hardships ahead. But, in the back of her mind, Antonia couldn't shake the image of Grayson, the carefree grasshopper, dancing under the sun. Could there be a balance between work and play? Could one live fully in the moment, without ignoring the future? As the sun began to set and the sky turned to shades of pink and gold, Antonia's thoughts lingered on this question. She didn't know the answer yet, but she was determined to find out. And so, the stage was set. The ant colony would continue to prepare for winter, while Grayson and the other grasshoppers would continue to enjoy the fleeting beauty of the present. But the changing seasons were on the horizon, and soon, the two worlds would collide in a way neither Antonia nor Grayson could have ever imagined. The colony was alive with the sound of busy ants scurrying about, working together in a harmonious dance of purpose. From early morning until the sun began to set, the ants had no time to waste. They followed the rhythm of the seasons, knowing that every moment of work brought them one step closer to their survival in the colder months. For Antonia, the day always began before dawn. She awoke from her chamber in the heart of the anthill, a carefully constructed underground fortress. The tunnels were cool and filled with a faint scent of earth and leaves. As a leader among her fellow ants, Antonia's chamber was a bit larger than the others, with walls lined with tiny carvings that marked the colony's history, events that had shaped their way of life. Her soft antennae twitched with anticipation as she prepared for another day of work. Antonia stretched her tiny legs and walked over to the central gathering chamber, where the rest of the colony assembled to discuss the day's tasks. A sense of urgency filled the air as the workers gathered to receive their instructions. The queen ant, the wise matriarch of the colony, oversaw all activities. She had given Antonia the responsibility of leading the day's foraging teams, ensuring that every ant was working in perfect coordination. Today we will gather seeds from the northern fields, Antonia said in a clear voice, addressing her fellow workers. The harvest will be plentiful, and we must gather as much as we can before the first frost. We must work together efficiently, as we always do. The workers nodded in agreement. Antonia's confidence and determination were contagious. She moved to the front, organizing the ants into teams. Some would collect seeds, while others would carry them back to the colony's food storage chambers. Each team had a specific task, and Antonia knew exactly how to make the most of every minute. Her leadership was a beacon of reliability in a world that often felt uncertain. As they marched out into the meadow, the sunlight bathed the landscape in a golden glow. The meadow was a place of beauty, but for Antonia, it was also a place of hard work. Every blade of grass, every flower, every stone was a reminder that there was always more to be done. Antonia led the group of ants as they scurried across the meadow, their tiny legs moving in unison. The meadow was alive with activity. Birds fluttered overhead, bees buzzed from flower to flower, and butterflies danced in the breeze. Yet, Antonia remained focused on the task at hand. She didn't have time to appreciate the beauty around her. There would be plenty of time for that once the work was done. The first stop was a patch of tall grass, where they found a cluster of seeds. The ants worked quickly, using their strong mandibles to cut the seeds from the plants and carry them back to the colony. Antonia moved back and forth between the teams, making sure everything was running smoothly. She didn't just supervise, she worked alongside the others, demonstrating her commitment to the colony's well-being. As they worked, Antonia overheard snippets of conversation from the workers. Some were eager, discussing the progress they had made in gathering food. Others, particularly the younger ants, were growing tired. They had been working long hours and were beginning to feel the strain of the summer heat. Keep going, Antonia urged. We are almost there. The future of the colony depends on what we do today. Her words were a reminder that every bit of effort counted. She could see the exhaustion in their eyes, but she also saw a flicker of resolve. It was this collective determination that had kept the colony strong for generations. The ants knew that their survival relied on each of them doing their part. After several hours of gathering, Antonia called for a short rest. The workers gathered in the shade of a large tree, catching their breaths and sipping from the tiny pools of water they had collected. Antonia took a moment to survey the field. She was proud of her team, but there was still much to be done. Just As Antonia was about to signal for the team to resume work, a familiar sound reached her ears, a soft, melodic tune drifting on the breeze. It was the unmistakable sound of a flute, played with light-hearted abandon. Antonia's antennae twitched with irritation. She knew exactly who was responsible for the music. In the distance, she spotted Grayson, the grasshopper. He was sitting atop a large rock, his green wings glistening in the sunlight as he played his flute, completely oblivious to the work that was going on around him. His tune echoed across the meadow, sweet and carefree, but it felt like an intrusion to Antonia. How could he sit there and play while everyone else worked so hard? As Antonia observed Grayson, she felt a mixture of frustration and confusion. Why didn't he understand? Why didn't he see the importance of hard work? In her world, there was no room for distractions. The future was always looming, and there was too much to do to waste time on things like music and leisure. Antonia, said one of the worker ants, Penny, breaking her thoughts. Shouldn't we be getting back to the colony? We still need to store all of this food. Antonia snapped back to the present and nodded. Yes, you're right. Let's gather our things and head back. We have a lot of work ahead of us. As the ants carried their bounty back to the colony, Antonia's mind remained on Grayson. She couldn't understand how anyone could live without worrying about the future. The meadow, while beautiful, was also a place of uncertainty. The seasons changed, and with each change came new challenges. How could Grayson be so carefree, so unconcerned? When they returned to the colony, the ants worked together to store the seeds in the underground chambers. Antonia oversaw the process, making sure everything was organized and that the colony was prepared for whatever lay ahead. But even as she worked, part of her couldn't shake the image of Grayson, sitting in the sun, carefree and free-spirited. That evening, as Antonia retreated to her chamber to rest, she found herself pondering the questions that had been building in her mind all day. What would happen when the cold winds of winter arrived? Would Grayson be ready? Would the grasshoppers have enough food to survive? Or would they be left to suffer the consequences of their carefree ways? Antonia knew that the winter months would test the colony's strengths, but it was a test they were prepared for. She was determined that her colony would thrive, no matter what challenges the future held. But deep down, she couldn't help but wonder, was there more to life than just work? Was it possible to balance responsibility with the joy of the present moment? As she closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, Antonia's thoughts lingered on these questions. She didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was certain. The coming months would reveal much about the choices they all made. As the days wore on and the sun continued to bathe the meadow in warmth, Grayson, the grasshopper, reveled in the joy of the present moment. While Antonia and the other ants worked tirelessly, gathering food and preparing for the colder months, Grayson had no such concerns. His days were filled with music, laughter. There was no reason to worry about tomorrow when today was so beautiful. Grayson lived in a small burrow under a willow tree, a peaceful spot with a view of the entire meadow. From here, he could see the ants scurrying back and forth, their tiny bodies busy with their endless work. The sight often made him smile, but he couldn't help but wonder, why didn't they just enjoy the sunshine? Why were they always so focused? On the future, every morning, Grayson would rise with the sun. He stretched his long legs, shook off the sleep from his wings, and began his daily routine. The first thing he did was step outside and let the warm rays of the sun kiss his green body. It felt good, and Grayson couldn't understand why anyone would want to spend their time underground or in the shade when there was so much beauty in the world above ground. With a soft chirp, Grayson would pull his flute from the corner of his burrow. It was a simple instrument, made from reeds he had found in the meadow, but it was capable of producing the most enchanting melodies. He loved to play, letting the music flow freely, drifting through the air like a gentle breeze. His tunes were often spontaneous, created on the spot, with no particular purpose except to enjoy the act of playing. As the notes echoed through the meadow, Grayson couldn't help but smile. The music was his way of connecting with the world around him. Each day felt like a celebration, a gift to be enjoyed without the burden of responsibility. He didn't have to worry about the changing seasons or what the future might bring. For Grayson, life was about living in the now, enjoying the moment as it came. Sometimes, the butterflies would flutter by, attracted to the sound of his music. Other times, the birds would stop for a rest, drawn in by the calming tune. Grayson enjoyed the company of these creatures, but he never felt the need to make long-term plans or worry about tomorrow. After all, the sun was shining today, and that was all that mattered. As the afternoon approached, Grayson would often take a break from playing and find a cozy spot to nap. He would find a soft patch of grass, stretch out, and close his eyes, letting the warmth of the day surround him. He didn't feel the need to rush through his days. There was no deadline, no pressing obligations. All that existed was the present moment, and that was enough. During these naps, Grayson would dream of the far-off lands he had never visited. He would imagine the mountains, the rivers, and the distant forests that stretched beyond the meadow. But even in his dreams, Grayson never worried about the future. He was content to live in the present, wherever he was, and whatever he was doing. But despite his carefree nature, Grayson was aware of the changing seasons. He could feel the shift in the air, the subtle cooling of the breeze. As the days grew shorter and the sun set earlier, Grayson noticed that there were fewer insects to play with. The flowers began to fade, and the trees started to lose their leaves. Yet, even with the signs of fall creeping in, Grayson felt no urgency. He had always lived in the moment, and the future seemed so distant, so abstract. It was almost as if it didn't matter to him. One day, as Grayson was resting near the edge of the meadow, he noticed Antonia and her fellow ants scurrying about, their tiny legs moving in perfect coordination. They were carrying food, building their nest, and preparing for something. Grayson had overheard the ants talking about the coming winter, but he didn't think much of it. After all, it was still warm, and the sky was blue. There was plenty of time before the cold months arrived. Curiosity piqued. Grayson decided to visit Antonia's colony. He hopped lightly across the meadow, landing near the entrance of the anthill. As he approached, he could hear the soft murmur of the ants, working below ground, their voices echoing through the tunnels. "Antonia," Grayson called out playfully. "What are you doing down there? You should come out and enjoy the sunshine." There's a whole world out here to explore. Antonia, who had been overseeing the workers, looked up in surprise. She had always known of Grayson's carefree nature, but she didn't understand how he could ignore the work that needed to be done. "We're preparing for winter," Antonia replied, her voice firm but polite. "The days are growing shorter, and we must make sure our colony is ready. There's no time to waste." Grayson laughed, his wings fluttering in amusement. "Winter? You're already thinking about winter? It's still summer. Come on, Antonia, take a break. Life is for living, not for working all the time. There's so much beauty to enjoy right now." Antonia narrowed her eyes, her antennae twitching with frustration. "You'll see, Grayson. When the cold winds blow and the food is scarce, you'll wish you had prepared. It's not enough to live for today. We must think about the future as well." Grayson shook his head, still smiling. "I don't see why you worry so much. The future will come when it comes. There's no point in stressing about it. For now, let's enjoy the warmth of the sun." As Grayson hopped away, humming his tune, Antonia stood there, her thoughts a whirlwind of frustration. How could Grayson be so naive? Didn't he see the signs of change? Didn't he understand that the future was always just around the corner, waiting to catch up with them? But despite her concerns, Antonia couldn't help but feel a flicker of curiosity. Grayson's carefree spirit was contagious. He had a way of making everything seem so simple, so easy. While she spent her days worrying about the future, Grayson seemed to be living a life free from such burdens. Could he be right? Could she too find a way to enjoy the present moment without constantly worrying about what was to come? As Grayson disappeared into the middle, his music once again drifting on the breeze, Antonia was left with more questions than answers. The world seemed divided, those who worked and those who played. Was there room for both in a balanced life? And if so, which path was a better one to follow? For now, all Antonia could do was continue her work. But deep down, she wondered if there was more to life than just preparing for the future. As the days passed, the once warm and sunny meadow began to show signs of the coming season change. The winds grew cooler, and the golden light of summer began to fade, replaced by the soft glow of autumn. The leaves of the trees started to turn shades of orange and yellow, falling gently to the ground in a swirl of color. The once vibrant flowers that had dotted the meadow were now wilting, their petals drooping under the weight of the cooler air. The scent of earth and leaves filled the air, signaling that the time to prepare for winter was upon them. For Antonia, the change was a constant reminder that time was running out. She could feel the cold in the air, and it weighed on her heart. She had seen it before, the long, harsh winters when food became scarce and survival was a daily struggle. She knew that the colony had to be ready. Every ant, every worker, had to contribute to the harvest, to build up the food stores that would keep them alive through the dark months. As Antonia made her way through the colony, overseeing the workers, her mind was occupied with thoughts of winter. The days were shorter, and the food they had gathered was still not enough to last through the cold. There was no time to waste. Every moment mattered, and yet, the work felt endless. The pressure to keep up with the demands of the colony grew heavier each day. Antonia paused as she stood by the entrance to the colony, looking out across the meadow. The once bustling fields now seemed quieter, the wind carrying the faintest chill. She could feel the unease growing within her as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The days of abundance were over, and the cold, unforgiving winter was coming closer with each passing hour. As she stood there, lost in her thoughts, she saw Grayson once again sitting on his rock, his flute in hand. He was playing a joyful tune, completely unaware of the change around him. His carefree spirit seemed out of place in the growing gloom of the season. The sight of him, so unconcerned and free, filled Antonia with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "Grayson," Antonia called out, her voice carrying a hint of urgency. "What are you doing? Don't you see what's happening? The seasons are changing, and winter is coming. You need to prepare." Grayson looked up from his flute, his green wings fluttering as he smiled at her. "Oh, Antonia, you worry too much. The sun is still warm, and there's plenty of time before winter arrives. Why don't you relax and enjoy the music?" Antonia's antennae twitched with irritation. "I can't relax. We need to gather more food before it's too late. Winter doesn't wait for anyone. You can't just sit around and play music. You need to start preparing for the cold months." Grayson's smile faltered, but he shrugged, seemingly unbothered. "I'm sure everything will be fine. You're always so focused on the future, but sometimes you need to just enjoy the present. Life's too short to worry all the time." Antonia stared at him in disbelief. "You don't understand, Grayson. The future isn't something we can ignore. It's coming, whether we're ready or not. And if you don't start preparing now, you'll regret it when the cold winds blow and the food runs out." Grayson laughed lightly, shaking his head. "You're too serious, Antonia. We all have our own way of living. I choose to enjoy each day as it comes. You should try it sometime. It's much more fun than worrying about things you can't control." Antonia felt her frustration building. She had always respected Grayson's carefree nature, but now it felt like a burden. She couldn't understand how he could be so indifferent to something as important as survival. Winter was coming, and if they didn't act now, it might be too late. Without saying another word, Antonia turned and hurried back to the colony, her thoughts racing. She couldn't shake the worry that Grayson's carefree attitude would lead to disaster. She had seen it before: the grasshoppers who had failed to prepare in time, who had starved when the cold arrived. She couldn't let that happen to Grayson. But how could she make him understand? Back in the colony, the workers were busy preparing the food stores, but there was still so much to do. The time for gathering was slipping away, and Antonia felt the weight of responsibility bearing down on her. She had to ensure that the colony would survive the winter. It was a task that no one could afford to ignore, least of all Grayson. As she worked alongside the other ants, her thoughts kept drifting back to the carefree grasshopper. Was there really time to sit idly by and enjoy the music when the future was so uncertain? Did Grayson truly believe that everything would work out on its own, or was he simply too proud to admit that he needed help? That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the meadow, Antonia stood at the entrance to the colony once more. The chill in the air was becoming more pronounced, and the sound of Grayson's music seemed distant, as if it were a memory from a warmer time. Antonia couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. Winter was coming, and no one, not even Grayson, could escape its grip. She knew she had to continue working, but a part of her couldn't help but wish that Grayson would come to his senses before it was too late. She took a deep breath and steeled herself. There was no time to waste. She had to ensure that the colony was prepared, even if that meant doing it alone. But deep down, she couldn't help but hope that, somehow, Grayson would see the value in preparing for the future. Because if he didn't, there would be no one to blame but himself when the cold winds arrived. As the days passed, the chill in the air became more pronounced. The once gentle winds that had carried the scent of summer now had a bite to them, reminding every creature in the meadow that the seasons were changing. Grayson could feel it too. The mornings were colder, the afternoons shorter, and the once thriving meadow now seemed quieter. Yet, as always, he shrugged off the signs, convinced that there was still time. After all, the sun was still shining, and his flute still played its cheerful tune. Why worry? One particularly crisp morning, Grayson woke to find the meadow covered in a thin layer of frost. The grass, once vibrant and green, now lay flat under a delicate sheet of ice, shimmering in the early light. It was beautiful, no doubt, but it was also a stark reminder that winter was creeping closer. Grayson stood on his favorite rock, stretching his legs and feeling the cold air on his wings. He smiled, his mind already shifting back to the joy of the moment. He pulled his flute from under his wing, ready to play a melody to welcome the day. But as he blew into the instrument, he noticed something strange. The usual sweet notes didn't come out. Instead, a soft, strained sound followed, as if the flute was struggling to produce the music he was so accustomed to. Confused, Grayson looked at his flute. He hadn't played it in a few days, but that shouldn't have been a problem. He gave the flute a gentle shake, thinking it might be clogged with moisture or debris. But when he tried again, the sound was still weak and hollow. His heart sank a little. This wasn't like him. Grayson loved his music, and it had always been his way to feel connected to the world. The idea that his music wasn't flowing as freely as it should made him uneasy, but he dismissed it quickly. It was probably just the cold air playing tricks on him, he thought. With a carefree chuckle, he tossed the flute aside and decided to take a walk through the meadow to clear his mind. As he hopped along, Grayson began to notice more subtle changes. The insects he'd once enjoyed sharing melodies with were fewer and farther between. The once busy bees and butterflies were now hiding in the shadows, seeking warmth in the remaining patches of sun. Grayson realized that food sources were starting to dwindle too. The plants were wilting faster than he had anticipated, and the insects that he would normally rely on for company were retreating into the underbrush. Though a slight sense of unease began to gnaw at him, Grayson still refused to believe that things were getting out of hand. "It's just a cold snap," he muttered to himself. "It'll pass. There's no reason to panic." But as the days wore on, the signs of winter's approach became harder to ignore. The frost that once came and went now lingered through the day. The cold winds picked up, and the sun's warmth seemed to diminish by the hour. Grayson's food sources were becoming scarce, and his efforts to find new ones were increasingly unsuccessful. The insects he relied on for both food and companionship were disappearing into the deeper parts of the meadow, away from the frost. One afternoon, Grayson found himself near the base of the large oak tree that stood at the edge of the meadow. He was feeling hungry and tired, but all the usual spots where he'd find food seemed barren. The few remaining berries were frozen over, and the grasses were stiff with frost. There was nothing to eat. Grayson's stomach growled, but he tried to ignore it. He had always found food easily before. Why was it so difficult now? He hopped to the nearest patch of flowers, hoping to find something to nibble on, but even they had withered under the cold. Suddenly, a sharp gust of wind blew across the meadow, and Grayson shivered, realizing for the first time how much the world around him had changed. The leaves from the trees now swirled around him, caught in the wind like dancing ghosts. The once warm air had turned bitterly cold, and Grayson's wings no longer felt light and free. There was an undeniable weight in the air, a pressure he hadn't felt before. For the first time, Grayson felt a flicker of doubt. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Winter was coming, and he wasn't ready. With a sigh, Grayson hopped back to his burrow under the willow tree, feeling the cold seeping into his body. He nestled into the warmth of his home, trying to shake off the uncomfortable feeling that had settled in his chest. The frost outside was becoming more persistent, and the world around him was growing quieter. It felt like everything was preparing for a long, cold sleep. But Grayson, ever the optimist, tried to push the anxiety away. "I'll be fine," he whispered to himself, though his voice lacked the usual conviction. "There's still time. I'll find food tomorrow. I always do." Meanwhile, Antonia and her fellow ants were in full swing, working tirelessly to ensure that their colony was ready for the winter. Every ant in the colony had a role, and Antonia was doing everything in her power to keep them on track. She oversaw the workers, made sure the food stores were growing, and ensured that no time was wasted. As the days grew colder, Antonia found herself glancing across the meadow more often. She couldn't help but notice Grayson, still lounging under the willow tree, still playing his flute. It seemed like he hadn't taken her warning seriously. She watched him from afar, a feeling of worry rising in her chest. The grasshopper still hadn't come to her for help, nor had he made any efforts to gather food. He was, in every way, unprepared for the hardships of winter. Antonia couldn't help but wonder if it was too late for him. The colony was ready, but Grayson was slipping further away from the reality of the situation. It pained her to see him so carefree, but she knew there was only so much she could do. She had to focus on the colony, on the future. If Grayson wouldn't listen to her, there was nothing more she could do. But as the days grew colder and the supplies grew thinner, Antonia found herself worrying about the grasshopper more than she cared to admit. Could he really survive the winter alone? Or would he eventually come to regret his carefree ways? The days continued to grow colder, and Grayson could no longer deny it. Winter was coming. The once vibrant meadow had turned into a frosty wasteland, with the ground hardening beneath his feet. Each morning, he would wake up to find more frost covering the grass, and the soft glow of the sun now seemed like a distant memory. Obscured by clouds and the chilling winds, Grayson had tried his best to stay positive, telling himself that things would get better. He had believed that somehow, the cold would pass and the warmth of summer would return. But deep down, he knew it wasn't true. The signs were everywhere. The animals had retreated to their homes, the flowers had withered away, and the air itself seemed to grow colder with each passing day. One afternoon, as Grayson sat on his rock, playing a slow, melancholic tune on his flute, he felt a deep sense of emptiness. The music no longer came as easily as it had before. His wings felt heavier, his body weaker, and there was an undeniable gnawing in his stomach, a hunger that he had been ignoring for far too long. His usual food sources were nowhere to be found. The insects had disappeared, and the plants that once nourished him had died or were buried under a thick layer of frost. Grayson's carefree attitude had carried him through many seasons, but it was now failing him. For the first time, he felt truly vulnerable. The world that had once seemed so full of music, laughter, and warmth now felt cold and uninviting. He was alone, and he realized that he couldn't survive this winter on his own. The harsh truth hit him like a cold wind. He had been so focused on the present, on enjoying the moment, that he had failed to prepare for the future. And now, as winter began to show its full force, Grayson was facing the consequences of his choices. He thought back to Antonia, who had warned him time and time again about the importance of preparation. He had dismissed her warnings as nothing more than the ramblings of a worried, overburdened ant. But now, standing in the middle of a barren meadow with no food in sight, Grayson realized how wrong he had been. His pride had kept him from seeking help. But now, as the cold seeped into his bones, he knew there was no other choice. He had to ask Antonia for help. With a heavy heart and a sense of humility, Grayson made his way across the frosty meadow, his legs slow and labored from hunger. He felt embarrassed, but he also knew that it was his only option. The meadow, once full of life and song, now felt like a desolate wasteland, and Grayson was no longer the carefree grasshopper he had once been. The reality of winter was undeniable, and he needed to do whatever it took to survive. As he reached the entrance to Antonia's colony, Grayson hesitated. The warmth of the underground world seemed so foreign to him, a stark contrast to the cold, empty world above. He could hear the faint sounds of the ants working, their voices a quiet hum in the distance. He felt out of place, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, Grayson called out softly, "Antonia!" Within moments, Antonia appeared at the entrance of the colony, her antennae twitching in curiosity. When she saw Grayson standing there, his body hunched and his wings drooping, her expression softened. She had seen him around the meadow for weeks now, always carefree, always with a song on his lips. But now, there was no music, no joy in his eyes. There was only exhaustion and a deep sense of regret. "Grayson?" Antonia asked, her voice a mix of concern and surprise. "What are you doing here?" Grayson swallowed, feeling a wave of embarrassment wash over him. I need help, Antonia. I didn't prepare for winter, and now I don't know what to do. I don't have enough food. I've been too focused on enjoying the moment to think about the future, Antonia's expression shifted. There was no anger or reproach in her eyes, only a quiet understanding. She had expected this moment, but it still pained her to see Grayson in such a state. She had warned him, but she had also known that he would have to learn this lesson for himself. "You should have listened to me," Antonia said gently, though there was no malice in her tone. "Winter doesn't wait for anyone, and now it's here." Grayson lowered his head, his wings trembling slightly. "I know, I was wrong, Antonia. I should have prepared. I was so focused on the present that I didn't think about the future. And now I'm paying the price." For a moment, there was silence between them. Antonia studied Grayson carefully, her thoughts racing. She had always believed in the importance of balance, working hard to ensure a stable future while still enjoying life in the present. But Grayson's way of life had always seemed so carefree and effortless. It had been hard for her to understand how he could ignore the future entirely. Yet, as she looked at him now vulnerable and regretful, she knew that he was sincere. Grayson had learned a valuable lesson, and there was no need to punish him further. Instead, it was time to show him the kindness and understanding that she knew he needed. "I'll help you," Antonia said, her voice softening. "You can stay here with the colony for the winter. We have plenty of food to share, and you can work with us to help gather more. But you must promise me that you'll contribute, Grayson. No more relying on others to do the work for you." Grayson's heart lifted at her words. He had feared that Antonia would turn him away, but her offer was a lifeline. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I promise, I'll help. I'll do whatever it takes." Antonia nodded, satisfied with his response. "Come inside then. It's warm here, and we have plenty of work to do." As Grayson followed Antonia into the warmth of the colony, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The lessons of the past few weeks weighed heavily on him, but he knew he had learned something invaluable. The future mattered, and even in a world full of beauty and music, it was just as important to prepare for what was to come. As Grayson stepped into the warmth of Antonia's colony, he felt a strange mix of relief and discomfort. The warmth of the earth was a welcome contrast to the biting cold of the outside world, and yet he felt like an outsider in this bustling, industrious community. The ants were already busy at work, gathering food, securing their nests, and preparing for the long winter ahead. Their movements were swift and purposeful, each ant contributing to the collective survival of the colony. Grayson, on the other hand, felt awkward. He had never worked this hard before. In the past, he had relied on the abundance of nature to provide for him, trusting that the world would always have something to offer. But here, in Antonia's world, survival depended on preparation, on effort, on teamwork. It was a world that required him to be accountable, to give something in return for the warmth and safety he had been offered. As Antonia showed him around the colony, Grayson couldn't help but admire the efficiency of the ants. There were no wasted movements, no idle chatter. Every ant seemed to have a purpose, a role that contributed to the greater good. Grayson was amazed by the organization and unity that he saw around him, and for the first time, he began to understand the depths of what Antonia had been trying to teach him. "Here," Antonia said, leading him to a large chamber where the food stores were being organized. This is where we keep the supplies for the winter. We've gathered seeds, leaves, and other food sources to ensure that we have enough to survive until spring. Grayson looked around, his eyes wide with awe. The chamber was full of food piles of seeds, dried leaves, and other nourishing treats. It was a far cry from the barren meadow he had left behind. Antonia continued, "We work together to ensure that every ant contributes to the food stores. It's a team effort. If one of us doesn't pull their weight, the whole colony suffers. Do you understand?" Grayson nodded, feeling a sense of guilt wash over him. He had been so selfish in the past, focused only on his own, without ever considering the consequences of his actions. Now, he realized that he had a responsibility not just to himself, but to the colony that had taken him in. The first task Antonia gave him was to help carry leaves and seeds into the storage chambers. At first, Grayson struggled. His wings weren't built for carrying heavy loads, and he found himself awkwardly shifting the seeds and leaves in his legs. The task felt difficult, even tedious, but with each step, he began to realize something important. This hard work, though exhausting, was a form of respect. It was a way of contributing to something bigger than himself. As the day wore on, Grayson grew more accustomed to the rhythm of the work. He learned how to carry the supplies more efficiently, and he began to feel a sense of pride in his contributions. The weight of the work still felt heavy on his shoulders, but it was no longer a burden. He understood now that every effort, no matter how small, mattered. During breaks, Antonia would occasionally check in on him, offering guidance and encouragement. Grayson began to notice the quiet strengths in her demeanor, how she led with patience and wisdom, never rushing or criticizing, but always guiding the ants with a steady hand. He began to admire her more than ever. She was the embodiment of everything he had lacked: responsibility, foresight, and care for others. As the days passed, Grayson continued to work alongside the other ants, learning more about the intricacies of life in the colony. He found himself forming connections with the other ants, sharing stories and laughter during their brief moments of rest. It was a far cry from the lonely existence he had lived in the meadow, where his only companions had been the fleeting joys of music and the beauty of the moment. Here, in the colony, Grayson felt a sense of belonging, something he had never truly experienced before. One evening, as they worked together in the storage chamber, Antonia approached him with a thoughtful expression on her face. "You've come a long way, Grayson," she said, her voice gentle but filled with sincerity. "I can see that you're learning the importance of hard work. But I also want you to remember something: preparing for the future is important, but so is living in the present. The key is balance." Grayson paused, considering her words. He had spent so much time focused on surviving the winter that he had forgotten the simple joys of life: the music, the beauty, the moments of joy that made existence worthwhile. He realized that Antonia wasn't asking him to abandon his carefree nature entirely. She was showing him that there was room for both work and play, responsibility and joy. "I understand now, Antonia," Grayson said softly, his voice filled with newfound respect. "I've learned so much from you and the colony. I never realized how much hard work and care goes into ensuring a future. And I think I've also realized that it's okay to find joy in the work we do. Antonia smiled, her eyes warm with approval. Exactly. Life is about finding that balance. Work hard, yes, but also take time to enjoy the fruits of your labor. That way, you can truly appreciate both the present and the future. Grayson smiled back, his heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. He had learned the importance of preparing for the future, but he had also rediscovered the beauty of the present. He was no longer the careless grasshopper he had once been, but neither was he a mindless worker. He had found a new rhythm in life, one that allowed him to contribute to the colony's survival while still embracing the joys of living in the moment. As the days turned into weeks, the work continued, and winter slowly began to settle in. The winds howled outside, but the colony remained warm and safe, its food stores plentiful and secure. Grayson had earned his place among the ants, not just through hard work, but through his willingness to learn and grow. He had become an integral part of the colony, a living testament to the power of change and the value of balance. And as he looked around at the bustling ants, their steady rhythm of work and play, Grayson felt a deep sense of belonging. The music in his heart had not disappeared, it had simply changed. It was now a melody of purpose, of connection, and of shared effort. And that, he realized, was the most beautiful music of all. As winter settled deeper into the meadow, the world outside grew even colder. The once vibrant hues of the grass and flowers had faded into a blanket of white, with snow beginning to fall more heavily each day. The cold winds howled through the trees, but inside the colony, the warmth of the earth offered a comforting refuge. Grayson, who had once been so preoccupied with his own desires, was now fully immersed in the work of the colony. The days were long, filled with tasks that ranged from gathering food and reinforcing the tunnels to maintaining the warmth of the colony. Grayson had grown stronger and more accustomed to the rhythms of hard work. He no longer looked at each task as a burden but as a necessary part of ensuring the colony's survival. And with each passing day, he felt a growing sense of pride in his contributions. However, it wasn't just the work that was transforming Grayson, it was also the bond he was developing with Antonia. Her leadership, wisdom, and unshakable dedication to the colony had slowly won him over. At first, Grayson had admired her for her efficiency and ability to stay focused, but now he saw her in a new light. She wasn't just a leader, she was a mentor, a friend, and someone he could trust. One evening, as Grayson and Antonia worked together in the food storage chamber, Grayson paused to reflect. He had been moving seeds and dried leaves into their proper places when Antonia stopped him. "You've been working hard lately," Antonia observed, her voice gentle but with a note of concern. "But you're also learning something important, aren't you?" Grayson wiped his brow, feeling a sense of accomplishment. The colony's food stores were now better organized than ever before, and the colony itself was in good shape for the winter. But despite the outward success, Grayson felt an underlying sense of discomfort, a subtle unease he couldn't quite place. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Grayson admitted, placing a leaf in the designated storage area. "When I first came here, I didn't understand the importance of what you were doing. I thought it was all about making the most of the present, living in the moment, and having fun. But now, I get it. The future matters too. Antonia smiled softly. That's part of it, Grayson. But it's more than just survival. It's about purpose. Every task we do, no matter how small, is part of a bigger picture. We don't just work to survive. We work to create something meaningful, something that will benefit us all, now and in the future. Grayson nodded, but there was something in her words that stirred a deeper reflection in him. Purpose. It wasn't just about gathering food, storing warmth, and preparing for the long months of winter. It was about the why behind everything they did. What was the purpose of all this work? What was the true meaning of surviving through the seasons if there was no greater goal or joy to look forward to? He had found himself focused on the how, the mechanics of survival. But he realized now that what mattered just as much was the deeper purpose of his efforts, the connection between the work he was doing and the community he was helping build. He wasn't just preparing for winter for his own sake, he was contributing to something bigger than himself. The survival of the colony, the warmth of their shared efforts, and the security they all enjoyed were all tied together. As Grayson continued to reflect, Antonia's voice broke through his thoughts. Grayson, you've grown so much since you first came here. You've worked hard, and you've earned the respect of the colony. But now it's time for you to step into a bigger role. Grayson looked up, surprised by her words. A bigger role? What do you mean? Antonia nodded, her gaze steady and full of understanding. The colony is thriving, but there is still much to be done. We need someone to take on the task of organizing the food distribution, ensuring that every ant gets the right amount of nourishment, especially as we enter the coldest months. I think you're ready for it. Grayson was stunned. He had never imagined being given such an important responsibility. Back in the middle, he had never needed to worry about anything like this. Everything had been provided for him without effort, without thought. But here, in the colony, every task, every role was critical to survival. The weight of the responsibility felt overwhelming, but Grayson was determined to rise to the occasion. I don't know if I'm ready, Antonia, Grayson said, his voice uncertain. I've never been in charge of anything like that before. Antonia smiled, her expression both warm and confident. I believe in you, Grayson. You've already shown that you understand the importance of hard work. Now, you need to trust yourself. You have the ability to guide others. You've learned so much from the colony, and now it's time to give back. Grayson took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle within him. He had come so far. He had gone from a carefree grasshopper who didn't think about the future to someone who understood the significance of contributing to the greater good. This was his moment to step into a new role and take on a new challenge. I'll do it, Grayson said with determination, his voice steady now. I won't let you down. Antonia's smile widened, a hint of pride in her eyes. I knew you'd rise to the challenge. Remember, you don't have to do it alone. You're part of a team. Trust your instincts, trust the colony, and you'll do great. The days that followed were filled with a new sense of purpose for Grayson. He began organizing the food distribution, ensuring that each ant received their fair share. He learned the importance of rationing, of making sure the food stores were carefully monitored, and of working together as a community to ensure that everyone was cared for. As he worked alongside Antonia and the other ants, Grayson's sense of responsibility grew stronger. He was no longer the carefree grasshopper who wandered aimlessly through the meadow. He had found his place in the colony, not just as a member but as a leader, someone who had earned the trust of those around him. And though the work was hard, it felt more meaningful than anything he had done before. Over time, Grayson's bond with Antonia deepened even further. She became not just a mentor but a true friend, someone he could rely on for guidance and support. And as the winter months dragged on, the colony grew closer, united by their shared efforts and the growing sense of purpose that permeated every task. Grayson had learned a valuable lesson. Survival was not just about making it through the harsh seasons, it was about building something that mattered. He had discovered the importance of community, the strengths of collaboration, and the joy of contributing to something greater than himself. As the cold winds howled outside, Grayson stood tall, his heart full of pride. He had found his purpose, and in doing so, he had found his true self. The winds howled louder than ever, sending gusts of icy air through the cracks in the colony's tunnels. Snow had been falling relentlessly for days, covering the meadow in a thick layer of white. It was the harshest winter the colony had faced in years. The once ample food stores were beginning to dwindle, and the ants were growing concerned. Every day, the workers scurried through the tunnels, moving food and supplies into the storage chambers, but the threat of the cold seemed unrelenting. Grayson had settled into his role as the colony's food coordinator, and though the work was demanding, he had grown into it. His confidence had increased, and he had earned the respect of the other ants. He was no longer the carefree grasshopper, but a trusted member of the colony, one who had a critical role in ensuring the survival of all. But now, with the brutal winter at its peak, the colony was facing a challenge that would test Grayson's leadership like never before. One of the colony's primary food storage chambers had been compromised. The walls of the tunnel had collapsed under the weight of the snow outside, causing a massive shift in the storage area. Much of the food that had been carefully gathered for the harsh months ahead was now buried beneath debris. Antonia had gathered the colony's leaders together to discuss the situation. Grayson stood at the edge of the meeting, listening intently, his heart pounding in his chest. The ants were worried there was a real possibility that they might not make it through the winter if they couldn't recover the food. Antonia, one of the older ants, a seasoned worker named Ulrich, spoke gravely. "We have to act fast. The food we lost is irreplaceable. If we don't recover it soon, we won't make it through the rest of the winter." Antonia nodded, her expression calm but filled with determination. "We will find a way." "Grayson, you've done a great job organizing the food stores. I need you to help coordinate the recovery efforts. This is going to be a team effort, and we need every ant to contribute." Grayson's heart skipped a beat. This was a moment he had been dreading. He had never faced a challenge like this before, one that could mean the difference between life and death for the entire colony. But he had learned so much over the past months, and he knew that this was his chance to prove what he had learned. "Of course, Antonia," Grayson said, his voice steady despite the rising pressure in his chest. I'll do whatever it takes. Antonia gave him a reassuring smile. I believe in you, Grayson. Together, we'll get through this. With the plan in place, Grayson led a team of ants to the collapsed storage chamber. The tunnel was narrow, and the air inside was cold and damp, but the ants pressed on, working together to clear the debris. The task was slow and difficult. Every shift of the snow seemed to make the tunnel more unstable, and the weight of the cold was beginning to take its toll on the workers. Grayson directed the ants with precision, making sure that everyone had a clear role and that no ant was left behind. His leadership had become a beacon of hope for the colony, and the ants worked tirelessly under his guidance. He could see the strain on their faces, the exhaustion in their eyes, but there was a shared determination that fueled them all. They couldn't afford to fail. As Grayson worked, he found himself thinking back to his earlier days in the colony. He had been so unsure of himself then, so focused on his own desires and whims. But now, he understood the true value of what he was doing. This wasn't just about survival, it was about the collective strengths of the colony, the bond they shared, and the responsibility he now had to them. He wasn't just working for himself. He was working for all of them. After hours of painstaking work, the ants finally reached the buried food stores. There, under a heavy layer of snow and debris, they found the precious supplies that had been lost. It was a victory, but the task wasn't over yet. The food had to be carefully transported back to the safe chambers without further damage. As Grayson organized the recovery process, his mind raced. They had only a limited amount of time before the snowstorm would make it even more difficult to navigate the tunnels. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. Then, as he glanced up, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. Antonia, her face pale and her movements slow, was struggling to carry a heavy load of food. She had been working non-stop, leading the efforts, but now her strength was beginning to fail her. The exhaustion was visible, but more than that, Grayson could see that she was pushing herself beyond her limits for the sake of the colony. Without thinking, Grayson rushed over to her side. Antonia, you need to rest. You've been working so hard. Let me take this load for you. Antonia shook her head weakly, but Grayson gently insisted. You've led us through so much. Let me help now. For a moment, Antonia met his gaze. Her eyes filled with gratitude and a trace of surprise. You've really grown, Grayson, she said quietly. I've seen you become the leader I knew you could be. You're not just following anymore, you're leading. Grayson nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into his heart. He wasn't the carefree grasshopper who had once been blind to the needs of others. He was now a leader, a guide, and a true member of the colony. Together, Grayson and Antonia led the final effort to transport the food back to the storage chambers. The colony worked in unison, their spirits lifted by Grayson's strength and leadership. As the last of the food was stored safely, the storm began to subside, and the wind eased. The ants had done it. They had faced the worst of the winter and come through stronger for it. Later that night, as the colony gathered to rest, Antonia approached Grayson once more. I couldn't be more proud of you, Grayson. You stepped up when we needed you most, and you helped save the colony. Grayson smiled, his heart full. I couldn't have done it without all of you. We did this together. And in that moment, Grayson understood fully what it meant to be a leader, not just to take charge, but to work alongside those you led, to share in the challenges, and to find strength in unity. As winter raged outside, the colony was safe and secure. Grayson had found his place not just as a member of the colony, but as a leader in his own right. His journey from a carefree, impulsive grasshopper to a thoughtful, responsible individual had come full circle, and he was now ready to embrace the responsibilities of both the present and the future. As the final days of winter passed, the snow began to melt, and the first signs of spring appeared on the horizon. The meadow, once blanketed in white, slowly began to stir with life. The once frigid air softened, and the warmth of the sun broke through the clouds, casting golden rays across the thawing ground. It was a new beginning, not just for the land, but for the colony as well. The colony had endured the worst winter in memory, but they had made it through together. Thanks to Grayson's leadership and the hard work of every ant in the colony, they had recovered the lost food, weathered the storm, and come out stronger on the other side. The ants had worked side by side, each contributing their efforts to the collective survival of the group. And now, as spring approached, the colony stood united and proud. Grayson walked through the tunnels, his heart light. It had been a long and difficult journey, but the colony had triumphed. They had faced hardship. They had lost much, but in the end, they had emerged victorious. The colony had more than enough food to carry them through the next season, and the members of the colony were healthy, safe, and optimistic about the future. As Grayson made his way to the central chamber, he saw Antonia standing there, surrounded by the other leaders of the colony. They were discussing the plans for the upcoming spring, how to expand the tunnels, how to gather more food, and how to ensure that they were always prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. Grayson, Antonia called, her voice filled with pride. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Grayson smiled and nodded. "We've really done it, Antonia. I never imagined how much I would learn in such a short time. The winter tested all of us, but we've grown stronger because of it." Antonia looked at him, her eyes filled with admiration. "You've grown into a true leader, Grayson. I knew from the moment you first stepped into the colony that you had the potential. You've proven it with your actions." Grayson felt a swell of pride at her words, but he knew that his journey was far from over. "I couldn't have done it without the help of everyone here. The colony is what makes us strong. It's the teamwork, the spirit of working together, that has brought us through." The other ants in the room nodded in agreement. They had all witnessed Grayson's transformation from a carefree grasshopper who had once dismissed the importance of hard work to a responsible and compassionate leader who had helped guide the colony through one of its most difficult challenges. The bond between Grayson and the other ants was stronger than ever, forged in the heat of adversity and the shared effort to ensure their collective survival. As the conversation shifted to plans for the future, Grayson found himself reflecting on everything he had learned. When he first arrived in the colony, he had been lost. He had no purpose, no understanding of what it meant to contribute to something greater than himself. He had been consumed by the pursuit of fun, never considering the consequences of his actions. But over the course of the long winter, he had come to understand the value of hard work, dedication, and community, he had seen how even the smallest actions could make a difference. How the work of one ant, no matter how seemingly insignificant, was part of a greater whole. How the strengths of the colony lay in the strengths of each individual, and how, together, they could overcome any obstacle. He had learned that leadership wasn't just about giving orders, it was about serving the community, making sacrifices, and showing others the way. But more than that, Grayson had learned the importance of compassion and empathy. He had witnessed Antonia's selflessness, her willingness to push herself beyond her limits for the good of the colony, and it had inspired him to become a better version of himself. Leadership, he realized, wasn't just about making the tough decisions, it was about caring for those you led and understanding their needs. The spring sun shone brightly through the opening of the tunnels, casting a warm glow over the colony. Grayson stood there, watching the workers begin their tasks, their spirits lifted by the promise of the new season. He felt a deep sense of pride as he looked at them, knowing that they had all played a part in ensuring the survival of the colony. Antonia approached him, her expression calm and content. "We've come a long way, Grayson, and I think we're ready for whatever the future holds." Together, Grayson smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace settle within him. "Together," he repeated, his heart full as he looked around. Grayson realized that the colony had not just survived the winter, they had thrived. They had faced hardship, uncertainty, and loss, but they had come through it all with strength, unity, and resilience. And in doing so, they had become more than just a group of ants, they had become a family. The lessons Grayson had learned about hard work, leadership, compassion, and community would stay with him for the rest of his life. He knew that the challenges ahead would not always be easy, but he was ready to face them. He had found his place, and he was no longer the carefree grasshopper who had once been so focused on himself. He was a part of something much bigger, a thriving, united colony that had overcome the odds and built a future for themselves. As Grayson stood there, surrounded by the bustling colony, he knew that no matter what challenges the future held, they would face them together, stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. And with that thought, he felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him, for the colony, for Antonia, for the lessons he had learned, and for the new beginning that awaited them all.